Chapter 21 of Recollections and Letters of General Robert E. Lee by Robert E. Lee, Jr. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21, Failing Health. The General declines lucrative positions in New York and Atlanta. He suffers from an obstinate cold. Local gossip. He is advised to go south in the spring of 1870. Desires to visit his daughter Annie's grave. After General Lee had accepted the presidency of Washington College, he determined to devote himself entirely to the interest and improvement of that institution. From this resolution he never wavered. An offer that he should be at the head of a large house to represent Southern commerce, that he should reside in New York, and have placed at his disposal an immense sum of money, he declined, saying, "I am grateful, but I have a self-imposed task which I must accomplish. I have led the young men of the South in battle. I have seen many of them die on the field. I shall devote my remaining energies to training young men to do their duty in life." To a request from some of his old officers that he should associate himself with a business enterprise in the South as its president, he replied with the following letter. Lexington, Virginia, December 14, 1869. General J.B. Gordon, President, Southern Life Insurance Company, Atlanta, Georgia. My dear General, I have received your letter of the 3rd instant and am duly sensible of the kind feelings which prompted your proposal. It would be a great pleasure to me to be associated with you, Hampton, B.H. Hill, and the other good men whose names I see on your list of directors. But I feel that I ought not to abandon the position I hold at Washington College at this time, or as long as I can be of service to it. Thanking you for your kind consideration, for which I know I am alone indebted for your proposition to become president of the Southern Life Insurance Company, and with kindest regards to Mrs. Gordon and my best wishes for yourself, I am very truly yours, R. E. Lee. His correspondence shows that many like propositions were made to him. The Christmas of '69, neither my brother nor myself was with him. Knowing of our plans in that respect, he wrote before the holidays to Fitzhugh, wishing us both the compliments of the season and a pleasant time in the visits we were going to make. Lexington, Virginia, December 18, 1869. My dear Fitzhugh, I must begin by wishing you a pleasant Christmas and many, many happy New Years, and may each succeeding year bring to you and yours increasing happiness. I shall think of you and my daughter and my grandson very often during the season when families are generally united, and though absent from you in person, you will always be present in my mind, and my poor prayers and best wishes will accompany you all wherever you are. Bertus will also be remembered, and I hope that the festivities of Brandon will not drive from his memory the homely board at Lexington. I wish that he will enjoy himself and find someone to fill that void in his heart as completely as he will the one in his system. Tell Tab that no one in Petersburg wants to see her half as much as her papa, and now that her little boy has his mouth full of teeth, he would not appear so lonesome as he did in the summer. If she should find in the burg a ducky to take his place, I beg that she will send him up to me. I duly received your letter previous to the 12th instant, and requested some of the family who were writing about that time to inform you. What I last wrote, I could not find it on my table and did not refer to it. The Mem says you excel her in counting, if you do not in writing, but she does not think she is in your debt. I agree with you in your views about Smith's Island, and see no advantage in leasing it, but wish you could sell it to advantage. I hope the prospects may be better in the spring. Political affairs will be better, I think, and people will be more sanguine and hopeful. You must be on the alert. I wish I could go down to see you, but think it better for me to remain here. To leave home now and return during the winter would be worse for me. It is too cold for your mother to travel now. She says she will go down in the spring, but you know what an exertion it is for her to leave home, and the inconvenience, if not the suffering, is great. The anticipation, however, is pleasing to her and encourages hope, and I like her to enjoy it, though I am not sanguine that she will realize it. Mildred is probably with you and can tell you all about us. I am somewhat reconciled to her absence by the knowledge of the benefit that she will be to Tab. Tell the latter that she, Mildred, is modest and backward in giving advice, but that she has mines of wealth on that subject, and that she, Tab, must endeavor to extract from her her views on the management of a household, children, etc., and the proper conduct to be observed toward husbands and the world in general. I am sure my little son will receive many wise admonitions which he will take open-mouthed. I have received a letter from your Uncle Carter telling me of his pleasant visit to you and of his agreeable impressions of his nephew and new niece. He was taken very sick in Richmond and delayed there so long that he could not be present at William Kennan's wedding and missed the festivities at his neighbor Gillian's and at Norwood. Indeed, he had not recovered his strength when Lucy wrote a few days ago, and her account makes me very uneasy about him. I am glad Rob has so agreeable a neighbor as General Cook, and I presume it is the North Carolina Brigadier. Footnote: a Virginian, son of General St. George Cook of the Federal Army, who commanded a North Carolina brigade in A.P. Hill's Corps, A.N., Virginia. End note. When you go to Petersburg, present my kind regards to Mr. and Mrs. Bowling, Miss Melville, and all friends. All here unite with me in love to you, Tab, and the boy, in which Mildred is included. Your affectionate father, R.E. Lee. General William H. F. Lee. In a note written the day after, acknowledging a paper sent to him to sign, he says, I wrote to you yesterday, Saturday, in reply to your former letter, and stated the reasons why I could not visit you. Your mother has received Mildred's letter announcing her arrival in Richmond, and will write to her there. I can only repeat my love and prayers that every blessing may attend you and yours. We are, as usual, truly and affectionately, R.E. Lee, General William H. F. Lee. The attack of cold from which my father suffered in October had been very severe. Rapid exercise on horseback or on foot produced pain and difficulty in breathing. After he was considered by most of his friends to have gotten well over it, it was very evident to his doctors and himself that there was a serious trouble about the heart, and he often had great weariness and depression. He complained but little, was often very bright and cheerful, and still kept up his old-time fun and humor in his conversation and letters. But his letters written during this year to his immediate family show that he was constantly in pain and had begun to look upon himself as an invalid. To Mildred, who was in Richmond on a visit to friends, he writes jokingly about the difficulty experienced by the family in finding out what she meant in a letter to him. Lexington, Virginia, January 8, 1870, my precious life. I received your letter of the 4th. We held a family council over it. It was passed from eager hand to hand and attracted wondering eyes and mysterious looks. It produced few words, but a deal of thinking, and the conclusion arrived at, I believe unanimously, was that there was a great fund of amusement and information in it if it could be extracted. I have therefore determined to put it carefully away till your return, seize a leisure day, and get you to interpret it. Your mother's commentary, in a suppressed soliloquy, was that you had succeeded in writing a wretched hand. Agnes thought that it would keep this cold weather, her thoughts running on jellies and oysters in the storeroom. But I, indignant at such aspersions upon your accomplishments, retained your epistle and read in an elevated tone an interesting narrative of travels in sundry countries, describing gorgeous scenery, hairbreadth escapes, and a series of remarkable events by flood and field, not a word of which they declared was in your letter. Your return, I hope, will prove the correctness of my version of your annals. I have little to tell. Gaiety continues. Last night there was a cadet hop. Night before, a party at Colonel Johnston's. The night preceding, a college conversazione at your mother's. It was given in honor of Miss Maggie Johnston's visit of a few days to us. You know how agreeable I am on such occasions, but on this I am told I surpassed myself. On New Year's Day, the usual receptions, many of our friends called, many of my ancients as well as juniors were present, and all enjoyed some good Norfolk oysters. I refer you to Agnes for details. We are pretty well. I think I am better. Your mother and sisters as usual. Custis busy with the examination of the cadets, the students preparing for theirs. Cadet Cook, who was so dangerously injured by a fall from his window on the 1st, it is hoped now will recover. The Misses Pendleton were to have arrived this morning, and Miss Ella Hennenberger is on a visit to Miss Campbell. Miss Lizzie Letcher still absent. Messrs. Anderson, Baker, W. Graves, Moorman, Strickler, and Webb have all been on visits to their sweethearts and have left without them. Mrs. Smith is as usual. Gus is as wild as ever. Footnote: Mrs. Smith and Gus were the names of two of the pet cats of my sister. Gus was short for Gustavus Adolphus. End note. We catch our own rats and mice now, and are independent of cats. All unite in love to you, your affectionate father, R. E. Lee. Miss Mildred Lee. A month later he writes again to his daughter in the same playful strain, and sends his remembrance to many friends in Richmond. Lexington, Virginia, February 2, 1870, my precious life. Your letter of the 29th ultimo, which has been 4 days on the road, reached me this morning, and my reply, unless our mails whip up, will not get to you before Sunday or Monday. There is no danger, therefore, of our correspondence becoming too brisk. What do the young girls do whose lovers are at Washington College or the Institute? Their tender hearts must always be in a lacerated and bleeding condition. I hope you are not now in that category, for I see no pining swains among them whose thoughts and wishes are stretching eagerly toward Richmond. I am glad you have had so pleasant a visit to the Andersons. You must present my regards to them all, and I hope that Mrs. Allen and Mary will come to see you in the summer. I am sure you will have an agreeable time at Brook Hill. Remember me to all the family, and tell Miss Bell to spare my friend Wilkins. He is not in a condition to enjoy the sufferings which she imposes on her Richmond beaux. Besides, his position entitles him to tender treatment. I think it time that you should be thinking of returning home. I want to see you very much, and as you have been receiving instruction from the learned pig, I shall expect to see you much improved. We are not reduced to apply to such instructors at Lexington. Here we have learned professors to teach us what we wish to know, and the Franklin Institute to furnish us lectures on science and literature. You had better come back if you are in search of information on any subject. I am glad that Miss Nanny Wise found one occasion on which her ready tongue failed her. She will have to hold it in subjection now. I should like to see Miss Bell under similar circumstances, provided she did not die from suppressed ideas. What an awful feeling she must experience if the occasion should ever come to her to restrain that active member. Although my friend Wilkins would be very indulgent, I think he would want her to listen sometimes. Miss Pendleton has just been over to give us some pleasing news. Her niece, Miss Susan Meade, Philip's daughter, is to be married next month to a Mr. Brown of Kentucky, who visited her 2 years ago upon the recommendation of the Reverend Charles Page, found her a schoolgirl, and has waited until she became a woman. He is rich, 49, and has 6 children. There is a fair start in the world for a young woman. I recommend her example to you. We are all as usual, and Mrs. Smith is just the same. Miss Maggie Johnston, who has been staying with us occasionally for a few days at a time, is now on a visit to us. There is to be an anniversary celebration of the societies of the Institute on Friday, and a students' party on Monday night, and a dance at the College Hotel. Tomorrow night your mother has an evening for some young students. Gaiety will never cease in Lexington so long as the ladies are so attractive and the men so agreeable. Surprise parties are the fashion now. Miss Lucy Campbell has her cousin, Miss Ella Hennenberger, staying with her, who assists her to surprise and capture 2 unwary youths. I am sorry to hear of Mrs. Oole's illness. If you see her, present me most kindly to her. Also to Mrs. George Randolph. Do beware of vanilla cream. Recollect how far you are from home, and do not tamper with yourself. Our semi-annual examination has been in progress for a fortnight. We shall conclude on Saturday, which will be a great relief to me, for in addition to other things, I have to be 6 hours daily in the examination rooms. I was sorry that I could not attend Mr. Peabody's funeral, but I did not feel able to undertake the journey, especially at this season. I am getting better, I hope, and feel stronger than I did, but I cannot walk much farther than to the college, though when I get on my horse I can ride with comfort. Agnes accompanies me very often. I must refer you to her and your mother for all local news. Give my love to Fitzhugh and Tab and Robert when you see them, and for yourself keep an abundance. I have received letters from Edward and Blanche. They are very anxious about the condition of political affairs in France. Blanche sent you some receipts for creams, etc. You had better come and try them. Your affectionate father, R.E. Lee, Miss Mildred Lee. The following letter to his son Fitzhugh further shows his tender interest in his children and grandson. Lexington, Virginia, February 14, 1870. My dear Fitzhugh, I hope that you are all well and that you will not let anyone spoil my grandson. Your mother has written all the family and Lexington news. She gathers much more than I do. I go nowhere but to the college, and when the weather permits, I ride in the mountains. I am better, I think, but still troubled. Mildred, I hope, is with you. When she gets away from her papa, she does not know what she wants to do. Tell her. You have had a fine winter for work, and later you will have a profitable season. Custis is well and very retired. I see no alarming exhibition of attention to the ladies. I have great hopes of Robert. Give much love to my daughter Tab and to poor little Life. I wish I could see you all. It would do my pains good. Poor little Agnes is not at all well, and I am urging her to go away for a while. Mary, as usual. Affectionately your father, R.E. Lee, General W.H.F. Lee. After waiting all winter for the improvement in his health, my father, yielding at last to the wishes of his family, physician, and friends, determined to try the effect of a southern climate. It was thought it might do him good, at any rate, to escape the rigors of a Lexington march, and could do no harm. In the following letters to his children, he outlines his plans and touchingly alludes to the memory of his daughter Annie, who died in 1862 and was buried at Warrenton Springs, North Carolina. Lexington, Virginia, March 21, 1870. My dear daughter, the doctors and others think I had better go to the South in the hope of relieving the effects of the cold under which I have been laboring all the winter. I think I should do better here, and am very reluctant to leave home in my present condition, but they seem so interested in my recovery and so persuasive in their uneasiness that I should appear obstinate, if not perverse, if I resisted longer. I therefore consented to go, and will take Agnes to Savannah, as she seems anxious to visit that city, or perhaps she will take me. I wish also to visit my dear Annie's grave before I die. I have always desired to do so since the cessation of active hostilities, but have never been able. I wish to see how calmly she sleeps away from us all, with her dear hands folded over her breast, as if in mute prayer, while her pure spirit is traversing the land of the blessed. I shall diverge from the main route of travel for this purpose, and it will depend somewhat upon my feelings and somewhat upon my procuring an escort for Agnes, whether I go further south. I am sorry not to be able to see you before I go, but if I return, I hope to find you here well and happy. You must take good care of your mother and do everything she wants. You must not shorten your trip on account of our departure. Custis will be with her every day, and Mary is with her still. The servants seem attentive. Goodbye, my dear child. Remember me to all friends, and believe me, your affectionate father, R.E. Lee. Miss Mildred Lee. Lexington, Virginia, March 22, 1870. My dear Fitzhugh, your letter of the 17th instant has been received. Lest I should appear obstinate, if not perverse, I have yielded to the kind importunities of my physicians and of the faculty to take a trip toward the South. In pursuance of my resolution, I shall leave here Thursday next in the packet boat, and hope to arrive in Richmond on Friday afternoon. I shall take with me as my companion Agnes, who has been my kind and uncomplaining nurse, and if we could only get down to you that evening, we would do so, for I want to see you, my sweet daughter, and dear grandson. But as the doctors think it important that I should reach a southern climate as soon as practicable, I fear I shall have to leave my visit to you till my return. I shall go first to Warrenton Springs, North Carolina, to visit the grave of my dear Annie, where I have always promised myself to go, and I think, if I am to accomplish it, I have no time to lose. I wish to witness her quiet sleep, with her dear hands crossed over her breast, as it were in mute prayer, undisturbed by her distance from us, and to feel that her pure spirit is waiting in bliss in the land of the blessed. From there, according to my feelings, I shall either go down to Norfolk or to Savannah and take you, if practicable, on my return. I would ask you to come up to Richmond, but my movements are unknown to myself, as I cannot know the routes, schedules, etc., till I arrive there, but I have promised not to linger there longer than necessary, so I must avoid temptation. We are all as usual. Your mother still talks of visiting you, and when I urge her to make preparations for the journey, she replies, rather disdainfully, she has none to make. They have been made years ago. Custis and Mary are well, and Mildred writes that she will be back by April 1st. We are having beautiful weather now, which I hope may continue. From your affectionate father, R.E. Lee. To his daughter Mildred he writes again, giving her the minutest details as to the routes home. This is very characteristic of him. We were always fully instructed as to the best way to get to Lexington, and indeed all the roads of life were carefully marked out for us by him. Lexington, Virginia, March 23, 1870. My dear daughter, I wrote to you the other day telling you of my intention of going south and of my general plan as far as formed. This morning your letter of the 21st arrived. I hope you will get back comfortably and safely, and if you can fall in with no escort, you had better go as far as Alexandria, the first stage of your journey. Aunt Maria, Cassius Lee, the Smiths, etc., would receive you. If you wish to come by Goshen, you must take the train from Alexandria on Tuesday, Thursday, or Saturday, so as to reach us on any of those evenings when you will arrive here about 12 o'clock at night. By taking the train from Alexandria on the alternate days, Monday, Wednesday, or Friday, you will reach Staunton that evening by 4 p.m., remain all night, and come over by daylight the following day in the stage. By taking the train from Alexandria to Lynchburg Mondays, Wednesdays, or Fridays, you will reach there the same afternoon, about 4 p.m., then go immediately to the packet boat, and you will arrive here next morning. This last is the easiest route and the best if you find no escort. Tell all the conductors and captains that you are my runaway daughter, and they will take care of you. I leave tomorrow evening on the packet boat. I told you that Agnes would accompany me. Tell my cousins Washington, Jane, and Mary that I wish I were going to see them. I should then anticipate some pleasure, but the doctors say I must turn my face the other way. I know they do not know everything, and yet I have often had to do what I was told without benefit to myself, and I shall have to do it again. Goodbye, my dear daughter. All unite in love. Your affectionate father, R.E. Lee. Miss Mildred Lee. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Recollections and Letters of General Robert E. Lee by Robert E. Lee, Jr. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22, The Southern Trip. Letters to Mrs. Lee from Richmond and Savannah. From Brandon. Agnes Lee's account of her father's greetings from old friends and old soldiers. Wilmington and Norfolk do him honor. Visits to Fitzhugh and Robert in their homes. It is to be regretted that so little was written by my father while on this trip. In the letters extant, he scarcely refers to his reception by the people at different points visited. His daughter Agnes tells more, and we can imagine how tenderly and joyfully he was greeted by his old soldiers, their wives, children, and friends. He was very unwilling to be made a hero anywhere, and most reluctant to show himself to the crowds assembled at every station along his route, pressing to catch sight of him. "Why should they care to see me?" he would say, when urged to appear on the platform of the train. "I am only a poor old Confederate." This feeling, natural to him, was probably intensified at that time by the state of his health. On Sunday he writes to my mother of his trip to Richmond and of his stay there. Richmond, Virginia, March 29, 1870. My dear Mary, I reached here Friday afternoon and had a more comfortable journey than I expected. The night aboard the packet was very trying, but I survived it, and the dust of the railroad the following day. Yesterday the doctors, Houston, McGraw, and Cunningham, examined me for 2 hours, and I believe contemplate returning today. They say they will make up their opinion and communicate it to Dr. Barton, who will write me what to do. In the meantime, they desire me to continue his prescriptions. I think I feel better than when I left Lexington, certainly stronger, but am a little feverish. Whether it is produced by the journey or the toddies that Agnes administers, I do not know. I have not been able to see anybody, nor was I able to get the groceries yesterday. Agnes thinks you will have enough to last till I get back here, when I will select them and send them up. Should you want any particular article, write to Messrs. Bacon and Lewis for it. I saw yesterday morning Mr. John Stewart and Miss Mary, footnote, Miss Mary Stewart of Brook Hill, afterward Mrs. Thomas Pinckney of South Carolina, end note, who had called to see Agnes, but found she was out. Miss Mary looked very sweet and inquired about you all. Agnes rode out there yesterday afternoon and saw all the family. I am told all our friends here are well. Many of my northern friends have done me the honor to call on me, among them Brick Pomeroy. They like to see all that is going on. Agnes has gone to church with Colonel Corley. I was afraid to go. The day is unfavorable, and I should see so many of my old friends to whom I would like to speak that it might be injurious to me. I was in hopes that Fitzhugh might make his appearance yesterday, when we should have learned all about those below, but he did not. I hear that they are all well, however. I expect to continue our journey tomorrow if nothing prevents, though I have not yet got the information I desire about the routes. Still, I will get on. I will leave to Agnes to tell you about herself. Love to all, truly, R.E. Lee. The next letter that I find is written from Savannah. Savannah, Georgia, April 2nd, 1870. My dear Mary, I reached here yesterday evening and have borne the journey much better than I expected. I think I am stronger than when I left Lexington, but otherwise can discover no difference. I have had a tedious journey upon the whole, and have more than ever regretted that I undertook it. However, I have enjoyed meeting many friends, and the old soldiers have greeted me very cordially. My visit to dear Annie's grave was mournful, yet soothing to my feelings, and I was glad to have the opportunity of thanking the kind friends for their care of her while living and their attention to her since her death. I saw most of the ladies of the committee who undertook the preparation of the monument and the enclosure of the cemetery, and was very kindly received by all the citizens of Warrenton, and indeed at all the towns through which we passed. Yesterday, several gentlemen from Savannah met the train in which we came from Augusta, General Lawton, Mr. Andrew Lowe, Mr. Hodgson, etc., etc. I found they had arranged among themselves about my sojourn, so I yielded at once, and after depositing Agnes at General Lawton's, I came off to Mr. Lowe's, where I am now domiciled. His house is partially dismantled, and he is keeping house alone, so I have a very quiet time. This morning I took a short drive around the city with Agnes and Miss Lawton, and on returning called on Mrs. Elliott, who has her two widowed daughters living with her, Mrs. Elliott and Mrs. Habersham. I also went to see Mrs. Gordon, Mrs. Gilmer, and Mrs. Owen, and then returned to the Lowes, where I find he has invited some gentlemen to meet me at dinner, General Joe Johnston, General Lawton, General Gilmer, Colonel Corley, etc. Colonel Corley has stuck to me all the journey, and now talks of going to New Orleans. The weather today is rather cool and raw, with an easterly wind, and if it continues, I will go on to Florida next week. The woods are filled with flowers, yellow jasmine covering all the trees, etc., and fresh vegetables everywhere. I must leave Agnes to give you all details. The writing desk is placed in a dark corner in this handsome house, prepared for younger eyes than mine, and I can hardly see what I write. All friends inquire after you, Custis, Mary, and Mildred. Give my love to all, and believe me most truly, R.E. Lee. Mrs. R.E. Lee. The Colonel Corley mentioned in the above letters had been on General Lee's staff as chief quartermaster from the time he assumed command of the Army of Northern Virginia until the surrender. His voluntary service as escort on this trip, so delicately offered and performed, was highly appreciated by his old commander. A letter from his daughter to her mother, written the next day, tells many particulars of their journey, but still leaves much to be desired. Savannah, Georgia, April 3, 1870. I hardly know where to commence. I have so little time to write. We left Richmond Monday, 2 p.m. We reached Warrenton at 10 o'clock and were taken to their house by Mr. and Mrs. White, who met us at the depot. The next morning, Papa and I drove with Captain White's horses to the cemetery. Mrs. White gave me a quantity of beautiful white hyacinths, which she said were for you, too, and I had brought some gray moss that Kitty Stiles had given me. This I twined on the base of the monument. The flowers looked very pure and beautiful. The place is just as it is in Mr. Hope's picture, which I have. It was a great satisfaction to be there again. We did not go to the springs a mile off. Returning, we stopped at Mr. Joe Jones, old Mr. J's son. They insisted on our taking dinner. He has 11 children, I think, and there were numberless others there. They loaded me with flowers, the gardens full of hyacinths and early spring flowers. Mrs. Jones is a very nice lady, one of those who were foremost in erecting the monument. We then stopped at the farm of the Joneses, who were at the Springs when we were there in the autumn of 1862, and Mrs. J. knew me at once and asked affectionately after you. Saw Patty and Emma, all the daughters married except Patty and the youngest. Mr. J. is very infirm, 83 years old. That evening a number of persons came to see us, Mrs. Alston and Mrs. Brownlow, 2 others of the Committee of Ladies. Everyone was very kind. Indeed, I wish you could travel with Papa to see the affection and feeling shown toward him everywhere. We spent that night in the sleeping car, very handsome and comfortable, but the novelty, I suppose, made us wakeful. At Raleigh and another place, the people crowded to the depot and called, "Lee! Lee!" and cheered vociferously, but we were locked up and mum. Everywhere along the road where meals were provided, the landlords invited us in, and when we would not get out, sent coffee and lunches. Even soldiers on the train sent in fruit, and I think we were expected to die of eating. At Charlotte and Salisbury there were other crowds and bands. Colonel Corley joined us at C, having asked to go to Savannah with us. The train stopped 15 minutes at Columbia. Colonel Alexander Haskell took charge of the crowd, which, in spite of the pouring rain, stood there till we left. General E. Porter Alexander was there, and was very hearty in his inquiries after all of us. His little girl was lifted into the car. Namesakes appeared on the way of all sizes. Old ladies stretched their heads into the windows at way stations, and then drew back and said, "He is mightily like his pictures." We reached Augusta Wednesday night. The mayor and council met us, having heard a few minutes before that Papa was on the train. We were whirled off to the hotel, and Papa decided to spend Thursday there. They had a reception the whole of the morning. Crowds came, wounded soldiers, servants, and working men even. The sweetest little children, namesakes, dressed to their eyes with bouquets of japonica, or tiny cards in their fat little hands with their names. Robert Burwell of Clark, who married Miss Clayton there, Randall, author of My Maryland, General McLaws, Wright, Gardner, and many others. Saw the Mrs. Boggs, General B.'s sisters. Miss Rebecca knew Mrs. Kirkpatrick very well and asked after her. Miss Russell, with whose father and sisters we had been at the White Sulphur, helped us to receive. She is very tall and handsome, and was superb in a white lace shawl, moire antique with a train. The Branch brothers rather took possession of me. Melville, who was at the Institute, Virginia Military Institute, Lexington, Virginia, and knew the Letchers very well, drove me in and around the town, at the rate of a mile a minute. Another brother took me to the skating rink at night, a serenade that night. At some point on the way here, Generals Lawton and Gilmore, Mr. Andrew Lowe, and others got on the cars with us. Flowers were given us at various places. I so much enjoyed the evidences of spring all along our route, more and more advanced as we proceeded. The jasmine, though passing away, was still in sufficient abundance in some places to perfume the air. The dark marshes were rich in tall magnolia trees, beautiful red buds, and other red blossoms I did not know. The jasmine and the trees hanging with gray moss, perfectly weird-looking, have been the least luxuriant places in the interim. Savannah is green with live oaks and filled with trees and shrubbery. I wish you could see a large marble table in the parlor, where I am writing, with a pyramid of jasmine in the center, and 4 large plates full at the corners, almost covering the square, all sent me Saturday. The Lawtons are as kind as possible, wanted Papa to stay here, but Mr. Andrew Lowe had arranged to take him to his house at bedtime. So he lost the benefit of a serenade from 2 bands alternating, which we enjoyed, General Lawton telling the crowd General Lee had retired from fatigue. Papa has borne the journey and the crowds far better than I thought he would, and seems stronger. Monday. It seems impossible to finish this. I enclose some scraps which will tell our story. Crowds of persons have been coming to see me ever since I came. Saw Mrs. General Johnston, Nanny Hutchison, of course, and Reverend and Mrs. Moore yesterday. They left today. Colonel Corley has taken Corinne, footnote, Corinne Lawton, end note, and me on a beautiful drive this morning to Bonaventure, which is to be a cemetery, and to several places in its vicinity. I never saw anything more impressive and beautiful than the avenues of live oaks, literally covered with long gray moss, arching over the roads. Tell Messrs. Owens and the Minnies I have seen their families, who are very kind to us. General and Mrs. Gilmer ask especially after Custis. We think of going to Florida in a few days. Haven't heard from you. Agnes. This is the only letter from his daughter Agnes written at this time that can be found. My father, in his letters to his family, left details and particulars for her to describe, and doubtless she did so. Unfortunately, there is but this single letter. On April 17th, he writes again from Savannah to my mother, My dear Mary, I have received your letter of the Wednesday after our departure, and am glad to hear that you are well and getting on so comfortably. The destruction of the bridge is really a loss to the community, and I fear will inconvenience Mildred in her return. However, the spring is now advancing, and they ought to be able to get up the new bridge. I hope I am a little better. I seem to be stronger and to walk with less difficulty, but it may be owing to the better streets of Savannah. I presume if any change takes place, it will be gradual and slow. Please say to Dr. Barton that I have received his letter and am obliged to him for his kind advice. I shall begin today with his new prescriptions and will follow them strictly. Tomorrow I expect to go to Florida and will stop first at Amelia Island. The visitors to that region are coming out, saying the weather is uncomfortably hot. If I find it so, I shall return. Savannah has become very pleasant within the last few days, and I dare say I shall do as well here as elsewhere. The spring, however, is backward. I believe I told you that I was staying with Mr. Andrew Lowe, who is very kind, and where I am very comfortable. I am going to be separated from Agnes, and have received invitations from several of the inhabitants where we could be united, but it is awkward to change. Agnes has been sick, too, since her arrival, which has made me the more anxious to be with her. You know she is like her papa, always wanting something. She is, however, better today, as I learn, though I have not seen her yet. I saw her twice yesterday. She was better then, and came down to Mrs. Lawton's room, so I hope she will be well enough to go with me to Amelia Island. The Messrs. McKay got down from Etowah last evening, both looking very well, and have reopened their old house in Broughton Street, which I am glad of. I have seen Mrs. Dr. Elliott and family, the Andersons, Gordons, etc., and all my former acquaintances, and many new ones. I do not think traveling in this way procures me much quiet and repose. I wish I were back. Give my love to her, his daughter Mary, and to Custis, and tell the latter I hope he will be able to keep Sam in the seats he may require. Praying a merciful God to guard and direct you all, I am most affectionately, R.E. Lee. P.S. I received a letter from F. All well, R.E.L. Sam was the gardener and man of all work at Lexington. My father took great interest in his garden and always had a fine one. Still, in Savannah, he again writes to his wife, acknowledging the letters forwarded to him and commenting on the steps being taken. Savannah, Georgia, April 11, 1870. My dear Mary, I received yesterday your letters of the 3rd and 6th, enclosing Reverend Mr. Brantley's and daughters and Cousin Cassius. I forwarded the petition to the President, accompanying the letter to Cassius, and asked him to give it to Mr. Smith. Hearing, while passing through Richmond, of the decision of the Supreme Court referred to, I sent word to Mr. Smith that if he thought the time and occasion propitious for taking steps for the recovery of Arlington, the mill, etc., to do so, but to act quietly and discreetly. I presume the petition sent you for signature was the consequence. I do not know whether this is a propitious time or not, and should rather have had an opportunity to consult friends, but am unable to do so. Tell Custis that I wish that he would act for me, through you or others, for it is mainly on his account that I desire the restitution of the property. I see that a resolution has been introduced into Congress to perfect the title of the government to Arlington and other national cemeteries, which I have been apprehensive of stirring, so I suppose the matter will come up anyway. I did not sign the petition, for I did not think it necessary, and believe the more I was kept out of sight, the better. We must hope for the best, speak as little, and act as discreetly as possible. The Reverend Dr. Brantley has invited us by the faculty of this college to deliver the baccalaureate sermon next June, and I invite him and his daughter, in the event of his accepting, to stay with us. Do you know whether he has accepted? I should have gone to Florida last Friday as proposed, but Agnes was not well enough. She took cold on the journey, or on her first arrival, and has been quite sick, but is better now. I have not seen her this morning, but if she is sufficiently recovered, we will leave here tomorrow. I have received a message saying that she was much better. As regards myself, my general health is pretty good. I feel stronger than when I came. The warm weather has also dispelled some of the rheumatic pains in my back, but I perceive no change in the stricture in my chest. If I attempt to walk beyond a very slow gait, the pain is always there. It is all true what the doctors say about its being aggravated by any fresh cold, but how to avoid taking cold is the question. It seems with me to be impossible. Everything and anything seems to give me one. I meet with much kindness and consideration, but fear that nothing will relieve my complaint, which is fixed and old. I must bear it. I hope that you will not give over your trip to the White House if you still desire to make it. I will commence my return upon the last of April, stopping at some points, and will be a few days in Richmond and the White House if able. I must leave to Agnes all details. Give much love to Custis, Mary, and Mildred. Tell the latter I have received her letters. Remember me to all friends. Most sincerely yours, R.E. Lee. Mrs. R.E. Lee. After visiting Cumberland Island and going up the St. Johns River as far as Palatka, and spending the night at Colonel Cole's place near there, they returned to Savannah. Colonel Cole was on General Lee's staff as chief commissary during the time he commanded the Army of Northern Virginia, and was a very dear friend of us all. Savannah, Georgia, April 18, 1870. My dear Mary, I have received your letter of the 13th, and am glad to learn that you propose visiting the White House, as I feared my journey might prevent you. I am, however, very anxious on the subject, as I apprehend the trip will be irksome and may produce great inconvenience and pain. I hope you received my letter of the 11th, written just before my departure for Florida. In case you did not, I will state that I forwarded your petition to Cassius Lee as received, not thinking my signature necessary or advantageous. I will send the money received from the University Publishing Company to Carter, for whom I intend it. Footnote. This was the money that came to General Lee from his new edition of his father's Memoirs of the War in the Southern Department of the United States. End note. I returned from Florida Saturday, 16th, having had a very pleasant trip as far as Palatka on the St. Johns. We visited Cumberland Island, and Agnes decorated my father's grave with beautiful fresh flowers. I presume it is the last time I shall be able to pay to it my tribute of respect. The cemetery is unharmed, and the grave is in good order, though the house of Dungeness has been burned and the island devastated. Mr. Nightingale, the present proprietor, accompanied me from Brunswick. Mr. Andrew Lowe was so kind as to go with us the whole way, thinking Agnes and I were unable to take care of ourselves. Agnes seemed to enjoy the trip very much, and has improved in health. I shall leave to her all details. We spent a night at Colonel Cole's, a beautiful place near Palatka, and ate oranges from the trees. We passed some other beautiful places on the river, but could not stop at any but Jacksonville, where we remained from 4 p.m. to 3 a.m. next morning, rode over the town, etc., and were hospitably entertained by Colonel Sanderson. The climate was delightful, the fish inviting and abundant. We have returned to our old quarters, Agnes to the Lawtons and I to Lowell's. We shall remain here this week, and will probably spend a few days in Charleston and Norfolk if we go that way, and at Brandon and Shirley before going to the White House, where we shall hope to meet you. I know of no certain place where a letter will catch me before I reach Richmond, where the doctors desire me to spend a few days that they may again examine me. Write me there whether Fitzhugh is too full to receive us. It will depend upon my feelings, whether, etc., whether I make the digression by Norfolk. Poor little Agnes has had, I fear, but little enjoyment so far, and I wish her to have all the pleasure she can gather on the route. She is still weak and seems to suffer constantly from the neuralgia. I hope I am better. I know that I am stronger, but I still have the pain in my chest whenever I walk. I have felt it also occasionally of late when quiescent, but not badly, which is new. Today, Doctors Arnold and Reed of this city examine me for about an hour. They concur in the opinion of the other physicians, and think it pretty certain that my trouble arises from some adhesion of the parts, not from any injury of the lungs and heart, but that the pericardium may not be implicated, and the adhesion may be between the pleura and blank, I have forgotten the name. Their visit was at the urgent entreaty of friends, which I could not well resist, and perhaps their opinion is not fully matured. I am continuing the prescriptions of Doctors Barton and Madison. My rheumatic pains, either from the effects of the medicine or the climate, or both, have diminished, but the pain along the breastbone ever returns on my making any exertion. I am glad Mildred has returned as well. I hope that she will continue so. After perusal, send this letter to one of the children to whom you may be writing, that Doctors Barton, etc., may be informed how I am getting along, as I have been unable to write to them or to anyone at Lexington. I have so many letters to write in answer to kind invitations, etc., and so many interruptions that my time is consumed. Besides, writing is irksome to me. Give my love to Fitzhugh, Tab, and Robert, and to Custis, Mary, and Mildred, when you write. Agnes said she was going out to return some of her numerous visits today, and I presume will not be able to write. She has had but little comfort in her clothes. Her silk dress was spoiled on the way, and she returned it to Baltimore, but has learned that they can do nothing with it, so she will have to do without it, which I presume she can do. I hope you may reach the White House comfortably. I will apprise you of my movements from time to time. I hope my godson will know you. Tell him I have numbers of his namesakes since I left Virginia, and of whom I was not aware. I hope they will come to good. With great affection, R. E. Lee. Mrs. R. E. Lee. From the following letters, all that I can find relating to this part of the journey, it appears that the travelers started for Virginia, stopping at Charleston, Wilmington, and Norfolk. Of their visit to Charleston I can find no record. He and Agnes stayed at the beautiful home of Mr. Bennett, who had 2 sons at the college, and a lovely daughter, Mary Bennett. I remember Agnes telling me of the beautiful flowers and other attentions lavished upon them. At Wilmington they spent a day with Mr. and Mrs. Davis. His coming there was known only to a few persons, as its announcement was by a private telegram from Savannah, but quite a number of ladies and gentlemen secured a small train and went out on the Southern road to meet him. When they met the regular passenger train from Savannah, General Lee was taken from it to the private one and welcomed by his many friends. He seemed bright and cheerful and conversed with all. He spoke of his health not being good, and on this account begged that there would be no public demonstration on his arrival, nor during his stay at Wilmington. On reaching that place, he accompanied Mr. George Davis to his house. Footnote: Attorney General in Mr. Davis's cabinet, end note, and was his guest during his sojourn in the city. Mrs. Davis was a Miss Fairfax, daughter of Dr. O. Fairfax of Alexandria, Virginia. They had been and were very old and dear friends and neighbors. The next morning my father walked out and called on Bishop Atkinson, with whom he had been well acquainted when they both lived in Baltimore some 12 years before, the one as rector of St. Peter's Episcopal Church, the other as captain of United States Engineers in charge of the harbor defenses of the city. There was a dinner given to my father that day at Mr. Davis's home, and a number of gentlemen were present. He was looking very well, but in conversation said that he realized there was some trouble with his heart, which he was satisfied was incurable. The next day, May 1st, he left for Norfolk, Virginia, where Dr. and Mrs. Selden were the kind entertainers of his daughter and himself. Agnes told me that in going and returning from church, the street was lined with people who stood, hats off, in silent deference. From Norfolk, they visited Lower and Upper Brandon on the James River, the homes of the Harrisons, then Shirley higher up the river. Then they proceeded by way of Richmond to the White House. My mother having arrived there from Lexington a short time previously, the General wrote from Brandon to his wife, Brandon, May 7, 1870. My dear Mary, we have reached this point on our journey. Mrs. Harrison and Miss Bell are well and very kind, and I have been up to see Mr. William Harrison and Mr. George and their families. The former is much better than I expected to find him, and I hope will recover his health as the spring advances. The ladies are all well, and Miss Gooley is very handsome. Agnes and I went over to see Warrenton Carter and his wife this morning. They are both very well, and everything around them looks comfortable and flourishing. They have a nice home, and as far as I could see, everything is prospering. Their little boy was asleep, but we were invited in to see him. He is a true Carter. Mrs. Page, the daughter of General Richardson, is here on a visit, and Mrs. Murdoch, wife of their former pastor, arrived this morning. We are to go up to Mr. George Harrison's this evening, where the children are to have some tableau, and where we are expected to spend the evening. In Norfolk we saw all our friends, but I did not succeed in getting out to Richard Page's as I desired, on account of the heavy rain on the appointed day, and engagements that interfered on others. Agnes and Mrs. Selden rode out, however, and saw all the family. Everybody inquired kindly after you, down to Bryan, and all sent their love. Brandon is looking very beautiful, and it is refreshing to look at the river. The garden is filled with flowers and abounds in roses. The yellow jasmine is still in bloom and perfumes the atmosphere. I have not heard from you or from Lexington since I left Savannah. I hope all are well. I am better, I trust, am getting fat and big, but am still rigid and painful in my back. On Tuesday night I expect to go to Shirley, and on Thursday, 12th instant, to Richmond, and on Friday to the White House, unless I hear that you are crowded, in which case I will submit myself to the doctors for 2 or 3 days, as they desire, and then go down. Agnes now says she will accompany me to the White House, so that I shall necessarily pass through Richmond, as our baggage renders that route necessary. Therefore, unless something unforeseen prevents, I shall be with you on Friday next. All unite in love. Agnes, I hope, is better than when she left Lexington, but is not strong. You must give a great deal of love to Fitzhugh, Tab, my grandson Robert, and all with you. Most truly and affectionately, R. E. Lee. P.S. Monday, your note of the 6th with Colonel Allen's letter has just been received. I am very sorry to hear of Tab's sickness. I hope that she will be well by the time of my arrival. I shall be glad to see Marky. R. E. Lee, Mrs. R. E. Lee. On the same date, he writes to his daughter Mildred at Lexington, Brandon, May 7, 1870, my dear daughter. Miss Jenny is putting up her mail and says that my letter must go with it, so I have but a few minutes to inform you that we have reached this point on our way home. We stayed a day in Wilmington with the Davises after leaving Charleston, and several with the Seldens in Norfolk, and shall on Tuesday next go up to Shirley and then to the White House. Agnes threatens to abandon me at Shirley, and I wish that you were there to take her place. I am better, I hope, certainly am stronger, and have less pain, but am far from comfortable, and have little ability to move or do anything, though am growing large and fat. Perhaps that is the cause. All here are well and send love. Miss Bell very sweet, all very kind. I rode yesterday to the other Brandons and saw all the inhabitants. Captain Shirley spent the day here, Mr. William Harrison much better, and Miss Gooley very pretty. They have some visitors. It is quiet and delightful here, the river beautiful. Agnes will write when she finds time, which is a scarce commodity with her. I had intended to write before breakfast the longest portion of the day, but walked out and forgot it. We have little time before breakfast. Give much love to Mary and Custis. I hope that you are all well and comfortable. I was very glad to receive your letter the morning I left Savannah, and I hope that Mrs. Smith and Traveller are enjoying themselves. I hope to get back to Lexington about the 24th, but will write. After paying my visit to the White House, I will have to spend some days in Richmond at the doctor's request, as they wish to examine me again and more thoroughly. I hope all are well at the college. Remember me to all there and in Lexington. With affectionate love, your father, R. E. Lee. Miss Mildred Lee. The White House, my brother's home at that time, is on the Pamunkey River, about 25 miles north of Shirley. From my father's letter, it is evident he had thought of driving over instead of going by boat and rail through Richmond. This plan was abandoned when his daughter determined to accompany him, as a lady's baggage, even in those days, was too voluminous for private conveyance. Mr. William Harrison lived at Upper Brandon and Mr. George Harrison at Middle Brandon. The mistress of Lower Brandon, the old historic home, was Mrs. Isabella Ritchie Harrison, widow of the late George Harrison. Miss Jenny, referred to in the above letter, was Miss Virginia Ritchie, sister of Mrs. Harrison. She had succeeded in having a post office established at Lower Brandon, and herself made postmistress. This was done for the convenience of the Brandons and the immediate neighborhood. The proceeds Miss Jenny gave to the Brandon Church. Of his visit to Shirley, his mother's home when she was a girl, and where she was married to Light Horse Harry, I can find no account written at the time. It is a few hours from Brandon to Shirley by steamer on the beautiful James, and they arrived there Tuesday, May 10th, and left the following Thursday by steamer for Richmond. So says the Home Journal, kept at Shirley. All the country came to see him, and there was a large party to dinner. One of the daughters of the house, then a young girl, says, I can only remember the great dignity and kindness of General Lee's bearing, how lovely he was to all of us girls, that he gave us his photographs and wrote his name on them. He liked to have us tickle his hands, but when Cousin Agnes came to sit by him, that seemed to be her privilege. We regarded him with the greatest veneration. We had heard of God, but here was General Lee. My mother was now at the White House. I will here introduce portions of a letter of the 9th and 13th of May from her to her daughter in Lexington, telling of my father's arrival on the 12th. White House, May 9, 1870. Fitzhugh took us on a delightful drive this morning, dear Mildred, to Tunstall's, where we got your letter, and Marky got 9, including yours, so we were much gratified with our excursion. The road was fine, with the exception of a few mud holes, and the woods lovely with wild flowers and dogwood blossoms, and with all the fragrance of early spring, the dark holly and pine intermingling with the delicate leaves just brought out by the genial season, daisies, wild violets, and heartsease. I have not seen so many wildflowers since I left Arlington. 13th. I determined after commencing this to wait and see your papa, who arrived last evening with Agnes. He looks fatter, but I do not like his complexion, and he seems still stiff. I have not yet had time to hear much of their tour, except a grand dinner given them at Mr. Bennett's. Your papa sends his love, and says he will be in Lexington somewhere about the 24th. There is no news. The country becomes more lovely each day. The locust trees are in full bloom, and the paulownia, the only tree left of all that were planted by poor Charlotte and myself. How all our labors have come to naught. The General has just come in. Robbie is riding on his knee, sitting as grave as a judge. He says now Marquis, Agnes, and many other words, and calls me bon maman. We expect Rob this morning. Yours affectionately, M.C. Lee. At this time my father was persuaded to make me a visit. He had been invited before, when at different times he had been to the White House, but something had hitherto always prevented his coming. Now he decided to come. My Romancoke farm was situated in King William County on the opposite side of the Pamunkey River, and some 15 miles east of White House. We arrived there in the afternoon, having come down by the steamer, which at that time ran from White House to Baltimore. Romancoke had been always a dependency of the White House, and was managed by an overseer who was subordinate to the manager on the latter estate. There was on it only a small house of the size usual in our country for that character of property. I had taken possession in 1866 and was preparing to build a more comfortable residence, but in the meantime I lived in the house which had been occupied by the different overseers for above 75 years. Its accommodations were very limited, simple, and it was much out of repair. Owing to the settling of the underpinning in the center, it had assumed a sway-back outline, which gave it the name of the broken-back house. No repairs had been attempted, as I was preparing to build a new home. My father, always dignified and self-contained, rarely gave any evidence of being astonished or startled. His self-control was great, and his emotions were not on the surface, but when he entered and looked around my bachelor quarters, he appeared really much shocked. As I was much better off in the matter of housekeeping than I had been for 4 years, I flattered myself that I was doing very well. I can appreciate fully now what he must have felt at the time. However, he soon rallied and concealed his dismay by making kindly fun of my surroundings. The next day at dinner he felt obliged to remark on my china, knives, and forks, and suggested that I might at least better my holdings in that line. When he got back to Richmond, he sent me a full set of plated forks and spoons, which I have been using from that day to this. He walked and drove over the farm, discussed my plans for improvements, and was much interested in all my work, advising me about the site of my new house, new barns, ice house, etc. He evidently enjoyed his visit, for the quiet and rest were very refreshing. About 30 miles as the crow flies from my place down York River is situated in Gloucester County, White Marsh, an old Virginia home which then belonged to Dr. Prosser Tabb, who, with his wife and children, was living there. Mrs. Tabb was a near cousin of my father, and as a little girl had been a pet and a favorite. His affection and regard for her had lasted from his early manhood. He had seen but little of her since the war, and when Cousin Rebecca, as we all called her, learned he was to be at the White House, she wrote begging him to pay her a visit. This he had agreed to do if it was possible. While at the White House, we had consulted together as to the best method of accomplishing this trip, and we determined to make it from Romancoke. So I drove him to West Point, and there got aboard the Baltimore steamer, taking my horse and trap with us. At Capahoosic, a wharf on the York, we landed and drove the 9 miles to White Marsh, arriving at supper time, as we still say in Virginia, i.e. about 7:30 p.m. When General Lee got off on the wharf, so great was the desire of the passengers and crew to see him that they all went to the side of the boat, which caused her to list so that I was unable to get my horse out through the gangway until the captain had ordered everyone to the other side. As the sun went down, it became chilly, and I drove quite rapidly, anxious to get my father out of the night air as soon as possible. He said nothing at the time, nor did I know that he noticed my unusual speed, but afterward he remarked on it to several persons, saying, "I think Rob drives unnecessarily fast." We were expected, and were met at the door by all the family and guests. A hearty welcome was given us. After supper he was the center of the circle in the drawing-room, and made the acquaintance of the children of the house and of the friends and relatives of the family who were there. He said little, but all listened eagerly to what he did say, and were charmed with his pleasant smile and gracious manner. Cousin Rebecca introduced him to her son-in-law, Captain Perrin, mentioning that he had been wounded in the war and was still lame from the effects. The General replied that at any rate he was all right now, for he had a pair of strong young feet to wait upon him, indicating his young wife. As was customary in this section of Virginia, the house was full of visitors, and I shared my father's room and bed. Though many a year had passed since we had been bedfellows, he told me that he remembered well the time when, as a little fellow, I had begged for the privilege. The next day he walked about the beautiful gardens and was driven over the plantation and shown the landscapes and water views of the immediate neighborhood. Mr. Graves, Dr. Tabb's overseer, who had the honor of being his coachman, fully appreciated it and was delighted when my father praised his management. He had been a soldier under the General and had stoutly carried his musket to Appomattox, where he surrendered it. When told of this by Dr. Tabb, my father took occasion to compliment him on his steadfast endurance and courage, but Graves simply and sincerely replied, "Yes, General, I stuck to the army, but if you had in your entire command a greater coward than I was, you ought to have had him shot." My father, who was greatly amused at his candor, spoke of it when he got back from his drive, saying that sort of a coward makes a good soldier. That the drive had fatigued him was quite apparent to Cousin Rebecca, who begged him to go and lie down to rest, but he declined, though finally at her request he consented to take a glass of wine. Mrs. Tabb was anxious to give a general reception that day in his honor, so that all the old soldiers in the country could have an opportunity of shaking hands with him, but at the General's request the idea was abandoned. Several persons were invited to meet him at dinner, among them the Reverend Mr. Phillips, an Englishman, the rector of Abingdon, an old colonial church in the county. He and his wife were ardent admirers of General Lee, and had often expressed a great desire to see him, so Mrs. Tabb kindly gave them this opportunity. They were charmed with him, and writing to their friends in England declared, "The greatest event in our lives has occurred. We have seen General Lee." One of his young cousins, in talking with him, wondered what fate was in store for us poor Virginians. The General replied with an earnest, softened look, "You can work for Virginia, to build her up again, to make her great again. You can teach your children to love and cherish her." I was struck with the tenderness of his manner to all these cousins, many of whom he had never seen before, and the real affection and interest he manifested toward them. He seemed pleased and touched by their love and kindness. I think he enjoyed his visit, but it was plain that he was easily fatigued. To catch our steamer the next morning, an early start was necessary. Arrangements were made the night before, and all good-byes said, for we had to leave the house about 5 o'clock. That night he was very restless and wakeful, and remarked that it was generally so with him whenever he had to get up at an unusual hour, as he was always uneasy lest he might be late. However, we got off in full time, made the connection with our steamer, and returned immediately to the White House. I left the steamer at West Point to take my father home, after which I joined him at the former place. After a short stay at the White House, he started for Lexington, stopping over in Richmond for a few days. From there he writes to his daughter Mildred in Lexington, Richmond, Virginia, May 23, 1870, my precious daughter. I came up from the White House this morning with Agnes, but she threatens to divorce herself from me, and we have already separated. She is at Dr. Fairfax's, and I am at Mr. McFarland's. She promises, however, to see me occasionally, and if I can restore our traveling relations, even at costly sacrifice, I shall be happy to take her along with me. I find I shall be detained here too long to take the Wednesday's boat from Lynchburg, but if not prevented by circumstances now not foreseen, I shall take the Friday's boat so as to reach Lexington Saturday morning, 28th instant. If Sam is well enough, and it should be otherwise convenient, he could meet me with Lucy and the carriage, or with Traveller. If not, I will get a seat up in the omnibus. Your mother proposes to leave in the boat for Bremo on the 1st Proximo, spend 1 week there, and then continue her journey to Lexington. Agnes has not yet made up her mind whether she will go with me, her mother, or remain for a while. I hope to find you well, though alone. I must reserve all accounts till we meet, which I am very anxious should take place as soon as practicable. I am improving, I think, in general health, but cannot tell certainly as to the difficulty in my chest, as I have been unable to test my progress. I had a pleasant visit to F. and Robert, and enjoyed rest there, which I wanted. Love to Custis, and kind regards to all friends. I hope that I shall find all well and doing well. All at the White House send love. Poor Tab is still sick. Marky Williams is with your mother. Robert came up with us, but returns this evening. I have seen Dr. Houston this morning, and I am to have a great medicine talk tomorrow. Your devoted father, R.E. Lee. Miss Mildred Lee. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Recollections and Letters of General Robert E. Lee by Robert E. Lee, Jr. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23, A Round of Visits. Baltimore, Alexandria, a war talk with Cousin Cassius Lee, Ravensworth, letters to Dr. Buckler declining invitation to Europe, to General Cooper, to Mrs. Lee from the Hot Springs, tired of public places, preference for country life. Judged by what he says of himself, my father's trip south did him no permanent good. The rest and change, the meeting with many old friends, the great love and kindness shown him by all, gave him much pleasure, and for a time it was thought he was better, but the main cause of his trouble was not removed, though for a while held in check. During the month of June he remained in Lexington, was present at the final examinations of the college, and attended to all his duties as usual. On July 1st he went to Baltimore in order to consult Dr. Thomas H. Buckler about his health. While there he stayed with Mr. and Mrs. Taggart. My mother had returned to Lexington after her visit to Bremo, together with my sister Agnes. To her on July 2nd he writes, Baltimore, Maryland, July 2nd, 1870. My dear Mary, I reached here yesterday evening at 9:15 p.m., found Mr. Taggart at the depot waiting for me, where he had been since 8 o'clock, thanks to his having a punctual wife who regulates everything for him so that he had plenty of time for reflection. I believe, however, the delay was occasioned by a change of schedule that day, of which Mrs. Taggart was not advised. We arrived at Alexandria at 5 p.m. and were taken to Washington and kept in the cars till 7:45, when we were sent on. It was the hottest day I ever experienced, or I was in the hottest position I ever occupied, both on board the packet and in the railroad cars, or I was less able to stand it, for I never recollect having suffered so much. Dr. Buckler came in to see me this morning and examined me, stripped, for 2 hours. He says he finds my lungs working well, the action of the heart a little too much diffused, but nothing to injure. He is inclined to think that my whole difficulty arises from rheumatic excitement, both the first attack in front of Fredericksburg and the second last winter. Says I appear to have a rheumatic constitution, must guard against cold, keep out in the air, exercise, etc., as the other physicians prescribe. He will see me again. In the meantime, he has told me to try lemon juice and watch the effect. I will endeavor to get out to Washington Peters on the 4th and to Goodwood as soon as Dr. B. is satisfied. Mr. and Mrs. Taggart are very well and send regards. The messenger is waiting to take this to the office. It is raining, and I have not been out, nor seen anyone out of the house. I hope all are well with you, and regret that I was obliged to come away. Tell the girls I was so overcome that I could not get up this morning till 8 a.m. Give much love to everybody, and believe me most truly, R. E. Lee. The advantages of early rising my father ever held out to his daughters, so that he knew they would enjoy hearing of his being late in getting down in the morning. During this visit to Baltimore, he took advantage of his proximity to many old friends to visit them. His next letter is from Alexandria to my mother. Alexandria, Virginia, July 15, 1870, My Dear Mary. I arrived here last evening from Goodwood, and was glad to hear from Burke this morning that our Aunt Maria was as well as usual. I wish to get out to Cassius Lee's this afternoon, and will spend tomorrow on the Hill in visiting General Cooper, Mr. Mason, the Bishop, etc. Footnote. Aunt M. was Mrs. Fitzhugh of Ravensworth, and Burke her colored servant. Cassius Lee, my father's cousin, General S.S. Cooper, Adjutant General of the C.S. Armies, Mr. J.M. Mason, Senator in U.S. and C.S. Congress, the Bishop, Bishop Johns of Virginia, all at that time living on the Hill, or Seminary Hill, about 2 miles from Alexandria. End note. Next week I shall go to Ravensworth, and from there think I shall proceed to Lexington. It is so hot that I shall be obliged to forego my visit to Nanny and the White House. It is intensely hot here, and I am unable to bear the heat now. I took cold yesterday in the cars or elsewhere, and am full of pains this morning, and was unable to sleep last night. I have seen Mr. Smith, footnote. Mr. Francis L. Smith was my father's lawyer. The matter referred to what caused the remark, "The prospect is not promising," was the chance of getting back the estate of Arlington from the U.S. government. Mr. Smith and Mr. Cassius Lee were my father's advisers in this matter. Nanny was the widow of Captain S.S. Lee, my father's brother. End note. I have seen Mr. Smith this morning and had with him a long business talk, and will see him again after seeing Cassius. The prospect is not promising. I got your letter at Charles's, thank Agnes for hers. All were well here and on the West River, and sent you all messages of love. I will give all particulars when we meet. I am at the Mansion House, where it is piping hot. I had felt better until I caught fresh cold, but no one can avoid it in such weather. Love to all. I cannot fix yet the day of my return, but it will be the last week in July. I hope Custis has got off, though I shall not be able to see him. Most truly and affectionately, R. E. Lee. Mrs. R. E. Lee. Mr. Cassius Lee was my father's first cousin. They had been children together, schoolmates in boyhood, and lifelong friends and neighbors. He was my father's trusted adviser in all business matters, and in him he had the greatest confidence. Mr. Cazenove Lee of Washington, D.C., his son, has kindly furnished me with some of his recollections of this visit, which I give in his own words. It is greatly to be regretted that an accurate and full account of this visit was not preserved, for the conversations during those 2 or 3 days were most interesting, and would have filled a volume. It was the review of a lifetime by 2 old men. It is believed that General Lee never talked after the war with as little reserve as on this occasion. Only my father and 2 of his boys were present. I can remember his telling my father of meeting Mr. Leary, their old teacher at the Alexandria Academy, during his late visit to the South, which recalled many incidents of their school life. They talked of the war, and he told of the delay of Jackson in getting on McClellan's flank, causing the fight at Mechanicsville, which fight, he said, was unexpected, but was necessary to prevent McClellan from entering Richmond, from the front of which most of the troops had been moved. He thought that if Jackson had been at Gettysburg, they would have gained the victory, for, said he, Jackson would have held the heights which Ewell took on the first day. He said that Ewell was a fine officer, but would never take the responsibility of exceeding his orders, and having been ordered to Gettysburg, he would not go farther and hold the heights beyond the town. I asked him which of the Federal generals he considered the greatest, and he answered most emphatically, McClellan, by all odds. He was asked why he did not come to Washington after Second Manassas. Because, he replied, my men had nothing to eat. And pointing to Fort Wade in the rear of our home, he said, I could not tell my men to take that fort when they had had nothing to eat for 3 days. I went to Maryland to feed my army. This led to a statement of the mismanagement of the Confederate Commissary Department, of which he gave numerous instances and mentioned his embarrassments in consequence. He was also very severe in his criticism of the newspapers and said that patriotism did not seem to influence them in the least, that movements of the army were published which frustrated their plans, and as an instance he told of Longstreet's being sent to the Western Army and the efforts that were made to keep the movement secret, but to no purpose, the papers having heralded it at once to friends and foe alike. I also remember his saying that he advocated putting the Negroes in the army and the arguments he advanced in favor of it. My father remarked at table one day that he could not have starved in the Confederate service if he could have gotten bread and milk. No, replied the general, but frequently I could not get even that. His love of children was most marked, and he never failed to show them patient consideration. On the occasion of this visit, his answers to all our boyish questions were given with as much detail and as readily as if we had been the most important men in the community. Several years after the war, I remember that my sister, brother, and myself, all young children, drove over to Arlington Mills, and that while going there, Colonel Lee rode up on a beautiful black horse. He impressed my childish fancy then as the handsomest and finest horseman I had ever seen, the beau ideal of a soldier. Upon seeing us, he at once stopped, spoke to each of us, and took my sister, then about 10 years of age, upon his horse before him, and rode with us for 2 miles, telling her, I remember, of his boy Robbie, who had a pony, and who should be her sweetheart. Often have I seen him on the road or street or elsewhere, and though I was only a boy, he always stopped and had something pleasant to say to me. The Mr. Leary mentioned here was my father's teacher when a boy in Alexandria. His regard and esteem for him was very high, as is shown in the following letter. Lexington, Virginia, December 15, 1866, Mr. William B. Leary. My dear Sir, your visit has recalled to me years long since past, when I was under your tuition and received daily your instruction. In parting from you, I beg to express the gratitude I have felt all my life for the affectionate fidelity which characterized your teaching and conduct toward me. Should any of my friends, wherever your lot may be cast, desire to know your qualifications as a teacher, I hope you will refer them to me, for that is a subject on which I can speak knowingly and from experience. Wishing you health, happiness, and prosperity, I am affectionately your friend, R.E. Lee. His next letter is from Ravensworth, where he went after his visit to the Seminary Hill. Ravensworth, Virginia, July 20, 1870. My dear Mary, I arrived here yesterday from Alexandria and found Aunt Maria well in general health, but less free to walk than when I last saw her. She is cheerful and quiet, but seems indisposed to try any of the healing baths, or indeed any of the remedies resorted to in cases of similar character, and seems to think nothing will be of avail. I hope in time that she will be relieved. Her niece, Mrs. Goldsborough, the daughter of her sister Wilhelmina, is with her. She seems to be a nice little lady, has a big boy of 8 months, and is expecting her husband tomorrow, so nothing need be said more on her account. Mr. Dickens was over last evening and reports all well with him. All the family are to be over this evening, so I cannot say more of them. Ravensworth is looking very well, I mean the house and grounds, but little of the farm seems to be cultivated and is growing up with pines. I received your letter directed to Alexandria after my return from my visit to Cassius, also Colonel Williamson's. Resolutions will not build the church. It will require money. Mr. Smith did not give so favorable an account of Mr. Price as did Mr. Green. I did not see Mr. P., for it would have been of no avail without having the plans, etc., and I cannot wait here to receive them. I shall have to send them or to invite him to Lexington after my return. I propose to leave here, if nothing prevents, on Monday, 25th instant. If I go by Goshen, I hope to reach Lexington that night or Tuesday morning after breakfast. I have heard a rumor that the water has been withdrawn from the canal above Lynchburg for the purpose of repairs. If that is so, I shall have to go by Goshen. My cold continues, but is better. The weather is very hot, and to me is almost insupportable. At 6 p.m. yesterday, the thermometer at Ravensworth Hall marked 86 degrees. This morning, when I first went out, it stood at 84 degrees. Thank Agnes for her letter. I cannot respond at this time. The letter you forwarded from Mrs. Podested describes the sickness her children have passed through. She is now with them at Capon, and Miss Emily has gone to visit Mrs. Barksdale in Greenbrier. Mrs. P. says she will be ready to visit you any time after the middle of August, that you will notify her. I am glad all are well with you, and hope the garden will give you some vegetables. I am anxious to get back and see you all. Give much love to the girls, including the Mrs. Selden. Tell them they must not leave till I return, that I am hurrying back as fast as rheumatism will let me. I have abandoned my visit to Nanny and the boys on the Pamunkey. Tell them it is too hot, and that I am too painful. Aunt M. sends love to all. Remember me to all friends. I must leave details till I return. Most truly and affectionately, R.E. Lee. Mrs. R.E. Lee. The building of the church here referred to was the Episcopal Church in Lexington, which it was proposed to take down and replace with a larger and better building. My father was a vestryman and also a member of the building committee. Dr. Buckler, whom my father had consulted in July, was at this time on a visit to Baltimore, having lived abroad with his family since 1866. When about to return to Paris, he wrote and asked my father to accompany him. This invitation he was obliged to decline. Lexington, Virginia, August 5, 1870. My dear Doctor, I have just received your letter of the 4th inviting me to accompany you across the Atlantic, and I return you my cordial thanks for your kind solicitation for my health and comfort. There is no one whom I would prefer to have as a companion on the voyage, nor is there one, I am sure, who would take better care of me. But I cannot impose myself upon you. I have given you sufficient trouble already, and you must cure me on this side of the Atlantic. If you are the man I take you for, you will do so. You must present my warmest thanks to your wife for her remembrance of me, and her kind offer of the hospitalities of her house. Should I ever be able to visit Europe, I shall certainly accept them, but I hope she will soon return to this country, and that you will bring her up to the mountains to us. We are all peaceable here now, and she will find that we are not as bad as we have been reported to be, and every one will extend to her a hearty welcome, whereas Europe is now convulsed with the horrors of war, or the agony of its expectancy, and I fear for a season is destined to feel the greatest calamity that can befall a people. I am happy to inform you that my health is better. I am pursuing your directions, and hope that I am deriving benefit from them. I have made my arrangements to visit the Hot Springs, Virginia, on Monday next, as you recommend, and trust I may find relief from them. My rheumatic pains continue, but have diminished, and that in my shoulder, I think, has lessened under the application of the blister. I shall endeavor to be well by the fall. The letter you enclosed to me was from Mrs. Smith on the Hudson, and not from Mr. Henry White, as you supposed. Goodbye, my dear Doctor. May you have a prosperous voyage, and find your family all well on your arrival, and may your own health be entirely restored. My family unite with me in every kind wish, and I am most truly your friend, R.E. Lee. Dr. Thomas H. Buckler. This letter to General Cooper, Adjutant General of the Confederate States Army, written at this time, explains itself and is one of many witnesses of my father's delicate consideration for old soldiers in distress. Lexington, Virginia, August 4, 1870. General S. Cooper, Alexandria, Virginia. My dear General, Impressed with all the people of the South with your merits and services, I have with them admired your manly efforts to support your family, and have regretted that more remunerative occupation, better suited to your capacities and former habits, had not presented itself. This has been a subject of conversation with some of us here, and when in Savannah last spring, I presented it to General Lawton, Colonel Cole, and others, and suggested that efforts be made to raise a sum for the relief of any pressing necessity. The idea was cordially adopted, and it was hoped that an amount would be contributed that would enable you to receive some relaxation. I have received a letter from General Lawton regretting the smallness of the sum collected, $300, and explaining the delay that had occurred, the general poverty of the people, the many calls upon them, and the disposition to procrastinate when facts are not known to them personally. To this sum I have only been able to add $100, but I hope it may enable you to supply some immediate want and prevent you from taxing your strength too much. You must also pardon me for my moving in this matter, and for the foregoing explanation, which I feel obliged to make that you might understand the subject. With my best wishes for your health and happiness, and for the useful prolongation of your honorable life, I am, with true regard, your friend and servant, R.E. Lee. He remained at Lexington only for a short time, as it was decided that he should go to the Hot Springs, Virginia, where he could try their famous waters for his rheumatism. On the day of his arrival, he writes to my mother, Hot Springs, Bath County, Virginia, August 10, 1870. My dear Mary, we reached here this morning about 9:30 a.m., Captain White and I, after as pleasant a journey as we could have expected. After taking the cars at Goshen, the old route by Millborough rose up so strong before me that we determined to adhere to it. Reached the Bath Alum about 4 p.m., where we passed the night and were in luck in finding several schools or parts of them rusticating on alum water. Mrs. Heath was in charge of the detachment from Dr. Phillips. Footnote: a well-known girls' school at Staunton. End note. They presented a gay and happy appearance. This morning we breakfasted at the Warm and had the attention of Richard. There is a small party there, Admiral Louis Goldsborough with his wife and Miss West amongst them. Here there is quite a company. Mrs. Lemon from Baltimore, her daughter, Mrs. Dobbin, Mrs. General Walker, wife of the ex-Secretary of War of the Confederacy, Mrs. and Miss Sevant, etc., etc. Dr. and Mrs. Cabell are here, and the Tardys and Mrs. Mack regret that you are not with me. I saw Mrs. Mays at the Warm, and her sister from Kentucky, Mrs. Tate. Reverend Dr. Mason and the Dangerfields have a girls' school in the village. The Warm seems to be retrograding. I hope the new man, Edward, has arrived. Tell him to take good care of the cow, and ask the girls to see to her and the garden, etc. I saw Mrs. Caskey at the baths. She looks very well. Her niece Gay is with her, a pretty little child. Mrs. Myers and her children are also there. Mrs. Asher also. Small company, but select. All pleased with Mr. Brown. Footnote: the manager of the hotel. End note. Tell the girls I have no one to rub me now. Shall miss them in this and other ways much. Dr. Cabell says I must continue my medicines and commence with the hot spout tomorrow. He has great confidence in the waters and says that 95 out of 100 patients that he has treated here have recovered. I shall alternate the spout with the boiler, but he says the great error is that people become impatient and do not stay long enough. I hope I may be benefited, but it is a tedious prospect. I hope that you all will continue well. If you wish to go to the baths or to come here, you must do so and write me what you want if there is anything I can do or get for you. Give love to all the girls and remembrances to all friends. Tell our neighbors that I was so occupied the last days I was in Lexington that I had not time to bid them adieu. If you want more money, let me know. God bless you and preserve you all. Goodbye, dear Mary. Most truly, R.E. Lee. Mrs. M.C. Lee. The Richard mentioned had been lately his house servant at Lexington, and Edward was a new man he had engaged for the garden and stable. The letters written to my mother and others of his family from the hot springs at this time were frequent, and I give them in full, as they tell all we know now of his visit there. Hot Springs, Bath County, Virginia, August 14, 1870. My dear Mary, I received this morning the last letter forwarded by you. The first batch arrived yesterday. I am glad to hear that you all continue well. I hope my letter of the 10th announcing my arrival has reached you. It should have done so, it seems to me, previously to your note of Friday. I have but little more to say than I had then. I have taken 4 baths, hot spout, which seems to agree with me very well, but it is too soon yet to look for results. I receive the water on my shoulder, back, and chest. The sensation is pleasant, and so far I have succeeded in preventing taking cold. The atmosphere, however, is damp and temperature variable. When the sun shines, it is hot, but when it rains, which is the usual condition of the weather, the former the exception, it is cool. Mrs. Sledge and party are here, the former improved. She was much better, went over to the White and Sweet, retrograded, and returned. Will stay here September. Many of our invalids are improving. Society has a rather solemn appearance, and conversation runs mostly on personal ailments, baths, and damp weather. There were some pretty tableaux last evening. The Misses Tardy, Mrs. Dobbin, and the little girls, the performers. Mr. Washington is here. Footnote: William Washington, a well-known painter of that day, who was for a short time professor of painting and drawing at the Virginia Military Institute at Lexington. End note. He looks well, is quiet, and has been copying points of scenery in the neighborhood. I do not know whether he was in search of health or the picturesque. The latter is more easily found in these mountains than the former. Captain White is well and sends remembrances to all. I hope Edward has arrived and is an improvement on the present occupant of the situation. If he does not present himself, retain Henry till I come. I will endeavor to find someone. You do not mention the cow. She is of more interest to me than the cats, and is equally destructive of rats. I am glad the girls are well. What are they troubling about now? I wish they were with me. I find many ladies here for neuralgia. Mrs. General Walker has been much benefited, also others. If little Agnes should desire to try the effects of the waters, tell her to come on. I will take care of her. I suppose Tab will go with her husband. I am sorry Fitzhugh is complaining. I have written to Rob and Miss Lottie. Footnote: Miss Charlotte Hexall, afterward Mrs. Robert E. Lee, Jr., who died in 1872. End note. I heard of Charles Carter's. Footnote: Charles Carter of Goodwood, Maryland, was my father's first cousin. Mildred and Ella, 2 of his daughters. End note. I heard of Charles Carter's passing up the road to the White, and Mildred preceded him a week. Ella, I hear, is much improved. I shall not go to the White unless specially called by something now unknown, but will remain here till the end of the month, if I find it profitable, and then return to Lexington. I hope the college is prospering. What does Mrs. Podestad say? I understand that Marquis Peter, Footnote: Mrs. Peter was a near cousin of my mother, and with her as a little girl. Our associations had been very near. End note. And child are occupying her old quarters at the Lomaxes near Warrenton. I have a merry time with my old cronies, tell Mildred. I am getting too heavy for them now. They soon drop me. I am getting uneasy about Edward and Blanche. The reverses of the French, which seem to be light, appear to have demoralized the nation. May God help all in affliction, and keep and guard you, and all with you, is my constant prayer. Truly and affectionately, R. E. Lee. Mrs. M. C. Lee. Hot Springs, Bath County, Virginia, August 19, 1870. My dear Mary, I received this morning your letters of the 14th and the 18th, enclosing Dr. Buckler's, and I was informed by Colonel Turner that he had brought the package to which you referred. He has not yet sent it to me, but no doubt will in time. I am sorry that Edward has not kept his engagement, for I liked his appearance and recommendations, though perhaps they are deceptive. You had better retain Henry till I come, unless you fall in with a better. I am glad that you are all well. You have such industrious little daughters that I am sure all will go well. Thank Agnes for her letter, and say to her that I have not seen Mr. Van Meter or Blair, but gave the letter to the former to Colonel White, who will send it to him when he finds out his position. Mr. Tom arrived this morning, and Mr. Johns and family rode over from the healing. They are there for a sick child. My old friend, Dr. Brodess, and the Reverend Mr. Jones also presented themselves. I have been trying the boiler for 4 days, and the spout the 5 preceding. I do not perceive any benefit yet, though some little change in the seat of my pains. I will continue till the middle of next week, the 29th, when, if no decided improvement takes place, I think of going over to the healing. Dr. Houston thinks that it will be beneficial, whereas Dr. Cabell recommends this. I am obliged to be in Staunton on the 30th ult. to attend a meeting of the Valley Railroad Company, so I shall leave here on the 29th for that purpose. After getting through with that business, I shall return to Lexington. I am sorry that I shall be called away, but I fear my stay here would be of no avail. Colonel White is well and sends regards to all. I am glad that the cow is better. She stands next in my affection to Traveller. I hope that Agnes's neuralgia is better, and as she has not accepted my proposition, I presume she declines. Hot bathing is not agreeable to me either in its operations or effects, but I see daily evidences of its good results in others. I wish that it suited your case. You must try and get someone in Sally's place if Tab, etc. come, and make them all comfortable. If you want more money, let me know in time. Send over to Mr. Leyburn for the flour when you want it. Mr. Bowie, I suspect, can arrange it for you. I fear Captain Brooks's house will not be ready for occupancy this fall. I hope that General Smith will begin Custis's in time. I heard of him on his way to Edward Cox the other day. Mr. Washington is still here. Better, I think. Again, love to all. Most truly and affectionately, R.E. Lee. P.S. Mr. Turner has just sent me the package. R.E.L. To his son Fitzhugh, who was at the White House with his family. Hot Springs, Bath County, Virginia, August 20, 1870. My dear Fitzhugh, I am very sorry to learn from your letter of the 18th, received this morning, that Tab is sick. I hope that it will be of short duration, and that she will soon throw off the chills. The mountain doctors, however, do not understand them as well as the lowland, and are apt to resort to the old practice. I wish that I could get to the White to see you, but my time is too limited. Owing to the late day that I was able to leave Lexington, I propose staying here till the 29th instant, which will only make my sojourn here 2½ weeks, and then going to Staunton, where I am obliged to attend a meeting of the Valley Railroad Company on the 30th. I hope that I shall not be detained there longer than a day or two, when I will return to Lexington, where I hope to find you all. You must tell Mr. and Mrs. Podestad, Mr. Carter, Ella, etc., how sorry I am not to see them at the White, but that I hope they will call at Lexington. I wrote to Ella on my first arrival here, but presume my letter failed to reach her. You did not mention how her health was. I am much concerned at Tab's indisposition, but I am glad to hear that the baby is well. Give my love to both, and I trust you will all be benefited by the mountain air. My personal health is good, but I see no change in my rheumatic attack, which is principally confined to my chest and back. I enclose a note from your mother, transmitted on the supposition that I would write to you. Professor White is with me, and I have some few acquaintances, but I am anxious to return. I am glad that Bertus has had a short visit to Orange. He says that he will come to Rockbridge in September. Custis will be there by the 1st, and we shall all, I hope, be together again. Affectionately, R.E. Lee. Hot Springs, Bath County, Virginia, August 23, 1870. My dear Mary, I have received your various notes of the 17th and 18th, and I am glad to hear of your well-being. Our good cow will be a loss to us, but her troubles are all over now, and I am grateful to her for what she has done for us. I hope that we did our duty to her. I have written to Mr. Andrew Cameron to inquire about a young cow he has of mine, and asked him to let you know if she is giving milk. If his report is good, you had better send for her. She is, however, young, and will require very gentle treatment. Caution Henry on that point. I have told him, Mr. C., also, that you would send for the horses, which I wish you would do as soon as you can see that they will be properly cared for. Tell Henry to be particularly gentle and kind to them, or the gray will give him great trouble. He must wash them clean and not pull out their manes and tails. The girls will have to exercise them till Custis comes. I suppose we may give up expecting Edward. Retain Henry till you can find someone better. You had also better engage some woman or man for a month as a dining-room servant. I think Easter has no intention of coming to us before October, and she will not come then if Mr. Blank can keep her. You will have so many friends staying with you that you cannot make them comfortable unless you have more servants. As I stated in a previous letter, I shall go to Staunton on the 29th. I hope I shall be detained but a few days. Lest your funds may run low, I send you a check. The girls can get it cashed. I may be detained, but I hope to return in time to see our children and friends. I have been here a fortnight today. I hope that I am better, but am aware of no material change, except that I am weaker. I am very anxious to get back. It is very wearying at these public places, and the benefit hardly worth the cost. I do not think I can even stand Lexington long. Colonels Allen and Johnston, footnote, Professors William Allen and William Preston Johnston of Washington College, the former afterward principal of the McDonough School near Baltimore, Maryland, the latter president of Tulane University, New Orleans, end note. Arrived this evening on horseback and had given me all Lexington news. Mr. Sledge and his wife from Huntsville, brother of the colonel, also arrived, and a Mr. and Mrs. Leeds from New Orleans, with 10 children, mostly little girls. The latter are a great addition to my comfort. I have written to Fitzhugh and Mrs. Podestad. Robert, you know, said she would make his annual visit the first week in September. Tell the girls they must make preparations to welcome all. Mrs. Walker, wife of the former Secretary of War in the Confederacy, is here with her son, whom she says she is anxious to place in college, and wishes to visit Lexington with that view. I have offered my escort and invited her to stay with us. I do not know whether she will go with me. The girls will have to prepare my room for some of the visitors and put me anywhere. I can be very comfortable in the library. Tell the little creatures they must work like beavers and get a supply of eggs and chickens. Recollect there is flour at Layburn's Mill when you want it. Thank Mildred for her letter. Remember me to all, and believe me always yours affectionately, R. E. Lee. Mrs. M. C. Lee. P.S. I send you an order for the horses. Tell Henry to take with him a bridle and halter. You must write for the cow if you want her. R. E. Lee. Mr. Andrew Cameron owned a fine farm near Lexington and kindly took care of my father's horses when he was away in the summer. Also, at different times, supplied him with a cow and took care of any calf, if there happened to be one, till it was of service. My father constantly rode out to see him and enjoyed talking farming as they rode together over his fields. His delight in every aspect of nature was real and ever present. These letters show, too, his care and consideration for animals. His letter to his daughter Agnes is in lighter vein. His playful moods, so usual with his children, never entirely left him. Hot Springs, Bath County, Virginia, August 23, 1870. My dear Agnes, I have received both of your letters, the last the 17th, and thank you for them, as well as for your care of my room and clothes. The former, I understand, is used for a multiplicity of purposes, and the cats and kittens have the full run of my establishment. Guard me against Miss Selden, I pray you. Footnote, Mildred's kitten. End note. I am sorry that you are not with me, as it is possibly may have benefited your neuralgia. But if Miss Bell is with you, I am sure she will be of greater service, and tell her she must remain till I come, that she may cure me. that you may have some other inducements than your flowers and weeds to take you out of doors. I will write to your mother to send for the horses as soon as she can make arrangements to have them cared for, and then you and Mildred and Miss Bell, the one on Traveler, the other on Lucy, can scour the country and keep us in eggs and chickens. I am sorry for the death of our good cow, but glad that she is out of misery. I do not think any of your friends are here. Mr. Washington has been vibrating between this place and the healing, but does not seem to be well. Miss Ullman from Salem, Massachusetts, whom you may recollect as having been at the White last summer, is here with her father and mother. Miss Molly Jordan left today, and Colonel Robert Preston arrived. The Chestnuts and Leverts are still here. I hope that you are well, and that all is well with you. When Custis comes, ask him to see to the horses and the cow, and that they are gently treated and properly fed. I know nothing of Henry's capacity in that way. I hope to be home next week, and am very anxious to get back. Your father, R.E. Lee. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Recollections and Letters of General Robert E. Lee by Robert E. Lee, Jr. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24, Last Days. Letter to his wife, to Mr. Taggart, obituary notice in Personal Reminiscences of General Robert E. Lee, Mrs. Lee's account of his death. The following is the last letter that I can find written by my father to my mother. He was back in Lexington early in September, and was never separated from her again while he lived. Hot Springs, August 27, 1870, my dear Mary. I have received your letter of the 22nd. I should remain here a week longer, if time permitted, as I have felt in the last few days better than I have yet, but I am obliged to be in Staunton on the 30th, and therefore must leave Monday the 29th. I should not have time to return here. The college opens on September 15th, and I wish to see that all things are prepared. Possibly the little improvement now felt will continue. If not, I shall have to bear my malady. I am truly sorry to hear of Edwin Lee's death. Footnote: Colonel Edwin Gray Lee was a near cousin. He had distinguished himself in the late war. At its commencement he had volunteered and was made a second lieutenant in the 2nd Virginia Regiment, Stonewall Brigade. From that rank he quickly rose to be lieutenant colonel of the 33rd Virginia in the same brigade. In 1862 his health, which was very feeble, compelled him to resign, but after a short time he again entered the service, though he never became strong enough to serve actively in the field. General Lee's opinion of his abilities was very high. End note. He was a true man, and if health had permitted, would have been an ornament as well as a benefit to his race. He certainly was a great credit to the name. Give my sincere sympathy to his wife and family. You have never mentioned anything of Dr. Graham. I have heard that he was in a critical condition. I saw Colonels Allen and Johnston. They only stayed a day and went on to the White. I have heard of them on their return, and presume they will reach Lexington tomorrow. Mr. George Taylor, who has been a month at the White, arrived here today. Both he and his wife are well. The company is thinning, though arrivals occur daily. Mr. Middleton and his daughter and son from Washington, whom you may recollect, also came, but I hope to see you so soon that I will defer my narrative. I am glad that Mary is enjoying herself and that Rob is so happy. May both long continue so. I will endeavor to get the muslin, but I fear I shall not succeed. I trust I may not be detained in Staunton more than a day or two. In that event, you may expect me Thursday, September 1st, but I cannot say as to time. I hope that I shall find you all well. Give my love to Agnes and Mildred and Custis, if he has arrived. Colonel Turner is very well. Tell his wife that he was exhibited today at the healing as a specimen of the health of the hot. In my last, I gave you my views about the servants and sent you a check for blank, which I hope that you have received. Most truly and affectionately, R. E. Lee. His last letter was written on the morning of the day he was taken ill, September 28th. It was to Mr. Taggart of Baltimore, at whose home he had stayed the previous summer. Its tone was cheerful and hopeful, and he wrote that he was much better and stronger. Lexington, Virginia, September 28, 1870. My dear Mr. Taggart, your note of the 26th reached me this morning, and see how easy it is to inveigle me into a correspondence. In fact, when a man desires to do a thing, or when a thing gives a man pleasure, he requires but small provocation to induce him to do it. Now I wanted to hear how you and Mrs. Taggart were, what you were doing, and how you had passed the summer, and I desired to tell you so. That is the reason I write. In answer to your question, I reply that I am much better. I do not know whether it is owing to having seen you and Dr. Buckler last summer, or to my visit to the hot springs, perhaps both, but my pains are less and my strength greater. In fact, I suppose I am as well as I shall be. I am still following Dr. B.'s directions, and in time I may improve still more. I expect to have to visit Baltimore this fall in relation to the Valley Railroad, and in that event I hope to see you, if you will permit me. I am glad to hear that you spent a pleasant summer. Colonel Blank and I would have had a more agreeable one had you been with us at the Hot, and as every place agrees so well with Mrs. Taggart, I think she could have enjoyed as good health there as at Saratoga, and we should have done better. Give my sincere regards to Mrs. Taggart, and remember me to all friends, particularly Mr. Blank. Tell Blank his brother is well and handsome, and I hope that he will study, or his sweethearts in Baltimore will not pine for him long. Captain Blank is well and busy and joins in my remembrances. Mrs. Lee and my daughters unite with me in messages to you and Mrs. Taggart, and I am most truly yours, R.E. Lee. S.H. Taggart, Esquire. When my brother Fitzhugh and I reached Lexington, my father was no more. He died the morning of our arrival, October 12th. He had apparently improved after his first attack, and the summoning of my brother and myself had been put off from day to day. After we did start, we were delayed by the floods which at that time prevailed over the state. Of his last illness and death I have heard from my family. The best account of those last days was written by Colonel William Preston Johnston for the personal reminiscences of General Robert E. Lee by the Reverend J.W. Jones, published in 1874. Colonel Johnston was an intimate friend of the General and a distinguished member of the faculty of his college. He was also one of the watchers by his dying bedside. I therefore give it in full. The death of General Lee was not due to any sudden cause, but was the result of agencies dating as far back as 1863. In the trying campaign of that year, he contracted a severe sore throat that resulted in rheumatic inflammation of the sac enclosing the heart. There is no doubt that after this sickness his health was more or less impaired, and although he complained little, yet rapid exercise on foot or on horseback produced pain and difficulty in breathing. In October 1869, he was again attacked by inflammation of the heart sac, accompanied by muscular rheumatism of the back, right side, and arms. The action of the heart was weakened by this attack. The flush upon the face was deepened, the rheumatism increased, and he was troubled with weariness and depression. In March 1870, General Lee, yielding to the solicitations of friends and medical advisers, made a 6 weeks visit to Georgia and Florida. He returned greatly benefited by the influence of the genial climate, the society of friends in those states, and the demonstrations of respect and affection of the people of the South. His physical condition, however, was not greatly improved. During this winter and spring, he had said to his son, General Custis Lee, that his attack was mortal, and had virtually expressed the same belief to other trusted friends. And now, with that delicacy that pervaded all his actions, he seriously considered the question of resigning the presidency of Washington College, fearful that he might not be equal to his duties. After listening, however, to the affectionate remonstrances of the faculty and board of trustees, who well knew the value of his wisdom in the supervision of the college and the power of his mere presence and example upon the students, he resumed his labors with the resolution to remain at his post and carry forward the great work he had so auspiciously begun. During the summer, he spent some weeks at the hot springs of Virginia, using the baths, and came home seemingly better in health and spirits. He entered upon the duties of the opening collegiate year in September with that quiet zeal and noiseless energy that marked all his actions, and an unusual elation was felt by those about him at the increased prospect that long years of usefulness and honor would yet be added to his glorious life. Wednesday, September 28, 1870, found General Lee at the post of duty. In the morning he was fully occupied with the correspondence and other tasks incident to his office of President of Washington College, and he declined offers of assistance from members of the faculty, of whose services he sometimes availed himself. After dinner at 4 o'clock, he attended a vestry meeting of Grace Episcopal Church. The afternoon was chilly and wet, and a steady rain had set in, which did not cease until it resulted in a great flood, the most memorable and destructive in this region for 100 years. The church was rather cold and damp, and General Lee, during the meeting, sat in a pew with his military cape cast loosely about him. In a conversation that occupied the brief space preceding the call to order, he took part and told with marked cheerfulness of manner and kindliness of tone some pleasant anecdotes of Bishop Meade and Chief Justice Marshall. The meeting was protracted until after 7 o'clock by a discussion touching the rebuilding of the church edifice and the increase of the rector's salary. General Lee acted as chairman, and after hearing all that was said, gave his own opinion, as was his wont, briefly and without argument. He closed the meeting with a characteristic act. The amount required for the minister's salary still lacked a sum much greater than General Lee's proportion of the subscription, in view of his frequent and generous contributions to the church and other charities, but just before the adjournment, when the treasurer announced the amount of the deficit still remaining, General Lee said in a low tone, "I will give that sum." He seemed tired toward the close of the meeting, and, as was afterward remarked, showed an unusual flush, but at the time no apprehensions were felt. General Lee returned to his house, and finding his family waiting tea for him, took his place at the table, standing to say grace. The effort was vain. The lips could not utter the prayer of the heart. Finding himself unable to speak, he took his seat quietly and without agitation. His face seemed to some of the anxious group about him to wear a look of sublime resignation, and to evince a full knowledge that the hour had come when all the cares and anxieties of this crowded life were at an end. His physicians, Drs. H.S. Barton and R.L. Madison, arrived promptly, applied the usual remedies, and placed him upon the couch, from which he was to rise no more. To him, henceforth, the things of this world were as nothing, and he bowed with resignation to the command of the master he had followed so long with reverence. The symptoms of his attack resembled concussion of the brain without the attendant swoon. There was a marked debility, a slightly impaired consciousness, and a tendency to doze, but no paralysis of motion or sensation, and no evidence of suffering or inflammation of the brain. His physicians treated the case as one of venous congestion, and with apparently favorable results. Yet, despite these propitious auguries drawn from his physical symptoms in view of the great mental strain he had undergone, the gravest fears were felt that the attack was mortal. He took without objection the medicines and diet prescribed, and was strong enough to turn in bed without aid, and to sit up to take nourishment. During the earlier days of his illness, though inclined to doze, he was easily aroused, was quite conscious and observant, evidently understood whatever was said to him, and answered questions briefly but intelligently. He was, however, averse to much speaking, generally using monosyllables, as had always been his habit when sick. When first attacked, he said to those who were removing his clothes, pointing at the same time to his rheumatic shoulder, "You hurt my arm." Although he seemed to be gradually improving until October 10th, he apparently knew from the first that the appointed hour had come when he must enter those dark gates that, closing, open no more to earth. In the words of his physician, he neither expected nor desired to recover. When General Custis Lee made some allusion to his recovery, he shook his head and pointed upward. On the Monday morning before his death, Dr. Madison, finding him looking better, tried to cheer him. "How do you feel today, General?" General Lee replied slowly and distinctly, "I feel better." The doctor then said, "You must make haste and get well. Traveler has been standing so long in the stable that he needs exercise." The general made no reply, but slowly shook his head and closed his eyes. Several times during his illness he put aside his medicine, saying, "It is of no use," but yielded patiently to the wishes of his physicians or children, as if the slackened chords of being still responded to the touch of duty or affection. On October 10th, during the afternoon, his pulse became feeble and rapid, and his breathing hurried, with other evidences of great exhaustion. About midnight he was seized with a shivering from extreme debility, and Dr. Barton felt obliged to announce the danger to the family. On October the 11th he was evidently sinking. His respiration was hurried, his pulse feeble and rapid. Though less observant, he still recognized whoever approached him, but refused to take anything unless prescribed by his physicians. It now became certain that the case was hopeless. His decline was rapid, yet gentle, and soon after 9 o'clock on the morning of October 12th, he closed his eyes and his soul passed peacefully from earth. General Lee's physicians attributed his death in great measure to moral causes. The strain of his campaigns, the bitterness of defeat, aggravated by the bad faith and insolence of the victor, sympathy with the subsequent sufferings of the Southern people, and the effort at calmness under these accumulated sorrows seemed the sufficient and the real causes that slowly but steadily undermined his health and led to his death. Yet to those who saw his composure under the greater and lesser trials of life, and his justice and forbearance with the most unjust and uncharitable, it seemed scarcely credible that his serene soul was shaken by the evil that raged around him. General Lee's closing hours were consonant with his noble and disciplined life. Never was more beautifully displayed how a long and severe education of mind and character enables the soul to pass with equal step through this supreme ordeal. Never did the habits and qualities of a lifetime, solemnly gathered into a few last sad hours, more grandly maintain themselves amid the gloom and shadow of approaching death. The reticence, the self-contained composure, the obedience to proper authority, the magnanimity, and the Christian meekness that marked all his actions still preserved their sway, in spite of the inroads of disease and the creeping lethargy that weighed down his faculties. As the old hero lay in the darkened room, or with the lamp and the hearth fire casting shadows upon his calm, noble front, all the massive grandeur of his form and face and brow remained, and death seemed to lose its terrors, and to borrow a grace and dignity in sublime keeping with the life that was ebbing away. The great mind sank to its last repose, almost with the equal poise of health. The few broken utterances that evinced at times a wandering intellect were spoken under the influence of the remedies administered. But as long as consciousness lasted, there was evidence that all the high, controlling influences of his whole life still ruled, and even when stupor was laying its cold hand on the intellectual perceptions, the moral nature, with its complete orb of duties and affections, still asserted itself. A Southern poet has celebrated in song those last significant words, "Strike the tent," and 1,000 voices were raised to give meaning to the uncertain sound when the dying man said with emphasis, "Tell Hill he must come up." These sentences serve to show most touchingly through what fields the imagination was passing, but generally his words, though few, were coherent. but for the most part, indeed, his silence was unbroken. This self-contained reticence had an awful grandeur in solemn accord with a life that needed no defense. Deeds which required no justification must speak for him. His voiceless lips, like the shut gates of some majestic temple, were closed, not for concealment, but because that within was holy. Could the eye of the morning watcher have pierced the gloom that gathered about the recesses of that great soul, it would have perceived a presence there full of an ineffable glory. Leaning trustfully upon the all-sustaining arm, the man whose stature, measured by mortal standards, seemed so great, passed from this world of shadows to the realities of the hereafter. A letter from my mother to a dear friend tells the same sad story. My husband came in. We had been waiting tea for him, and I remarked, "You have kept us waiting a long time. Where have you been?" He did not reply, but stood up as if to say grace. Yet no word proceeded from his lips, and he sat down in his chair, perfectly upright, and with a sublime air of resignation on his countenance, and did not attempt a reply to our inquiries. That look was never to be forgotten, and I have no doubt he felt that his hour had come, for though he submitted to the doctors, who were immediately summoned and who had not even reached their homes from the same vestry meeting, yet his whole demeanor during his illness showed one who had taken leave of earth. He never smiled and rarely attempted to speak except in his dreams, and then he wandered to those dreadful battlefields. Once, when Agnes urged him to take some medicine, which he always did with reluctance, he looked at her and said, "It is no use." But afterward he took it. When he became so much better, the doctors said, "You must soon get out and ride your favorite gray." He shook his head most emphatically and looked upward. He slept a great deal, but knew us all, greeted us with a kindly pressure of the hand, and loved to have us around him. For the last 48 hours he seemed quite insensible of our presence. He breathed more heavily, and at last sank to rest with one deep-drawn sigh. And oh, what a glorious rest was in store for him. End of chapter 24. End of Recollections and Letters of General Robert E. Lee by Robert E. Lee, Jr.